PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. What we're talking about are compounds that have a strong molecular bond. It's a carbon-fluorine bond that is very, very persistent and very strong. Experts typically, at least from the policy perspective, tend to break them down into two categories. There's the long chain, which are 6 or more carbons on the backbone, and the short chain, which are fewer number of carbons. The long chains, we're talking about like PFOA and PFOS. Those are the two that were used most historically and are probably the ones you might be familiar with that are sort of at the center of some contaminations right now. The short chains are things like Gen X and PFBS. Those are the chemicals that were used by a lot of companies as replacements for the longer chains when the longer chains were commercially phased out within the US, although some are still in imports. So that really strong molecular bond means that they are very resistant to water and to liquids, makes them very commercially useful, but also means that it takes a very, very long time for them to break down in the environment. So that has earned them the nickname forever chemicals. As I said, very commercially useful. They have been used in everything from Teflon and nonstick cookware to outdoor gear, raincoats, tents, that sort of thing. Stain-resistant carpeting, food packaging. Anything you get like French fries or greasy food in might have PFAS in the packaging. Personal care products, sunscreen, dental floss, and then firefighting foam. That one has gotten a lot of attention because we found many contaminated sites near military bases. PFAS has been used in what's called aqueous film-forming foam. So what would essentially happen is it would create this slick layer that would suffocate the fire, and that has been very useful from a firefighting perspective, especially for the military. So think about the military. They have aircraft carriers and submarines. You're storing jet fuel in very close proximity to munitions. So being able to put that fire out really quickly is a matter of life and death. So PFAS it was written into the military specifications for firefighting foam that the foam had to contain PFAS in it. So it has been used broadly by the military, and not just in fighting fires, but also in exercises. The military does lots of drills and training to make sure that service members are going to be ready the minute that something happens for real. So exercises have taken place using this foam at many, many sites around the country. Right now, the Pentagon estimates that there are 401 sites of known or suspected contamination from just PFOA and PFOS. So not only are these chemicals in many products that we come into contact with every day, but they're also in all of us. The CDC did a study a few years ago, blood tests of many Americans, and found that they were in 99% of Americans' blood. Now, the good news is that as PFOA and PFOS have been phased out of commercial production in the US, we're seeing the levels go down, but it's fair to assume that all of us have this stuff in our bloods. So how is it getting there? One of the pathways, and the pathway that has gained sort of the most public attention recently, has been through drinking water. There have been a number of high-profile contaminations, areas like Hoosick Falls, as you all know, Bennington, Vermont, areas around industrial sites where companies were manufacturing these chemicals, and as I said, around military bases. So the Environmental Working Group at Northeastern University put together this map of known contaminated sites around the country. You might notice, let's see if I can get the pointer to work, that there's a particular concentration around Michigan and New Jersey. Is that because Michigan and New Jersey were using more of these chemicals than the rest of the states? Probably not. It's because those are the two states that have gone out and proactively looked for contaminated sites, and they found many of them. So many people think that if other states were to do the same thing and go out and look for contaminated sites, that the rest of the map would look much more like those two states. But even as it is, you can see there are contaminated sites in just about every state around the country, and those are just the known ones. So these chemicals are in some drinking water, in the groundwater, and in all of us. But what does that mean from a health perspective? This is very much an active area of research, both among academic researchers and among federal agencies. There are the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry within the CDC is doing active work around this. The National Institutes for Environmental Health has a lot of work ongoing. And of course, the Defense Department and others that are potentially responsible parties. So one of the places where we've drawn some conclusions around the health effects, around sort of what this body of research tells us, has been through some litigation. There was a really interesting case brought around Parkersburg, West Virginia. So that's where there was a DuPont Teflon facility. The community around there started noticing some ill health problems among themselves and among the animals. It's an agricultural area. And they brought a lawsuit, a plaintiff's personal injury suit. And as a part of that lawsuit, the first phase of the trial had DuPont and the plaintiffs agreed to jointly select experts for an independent expert panel that would go through the research and assess and come to some conclusions around what this sort of conflicting body of research told us about the links between exposure, in this case specifically to PFOA, and various illnesses. So this was done, the reports came out in the 2011-2012 timeframe, and they went through a number of different potential ailments. And the 6 that they concluded there was a probable link between exposure and the health effect were these: kidney and testicular cancer, high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, and preeclampsia. So that's just PFOA. There's general recognition that PFOA and PFOS often share similar health effects, but I don't know if I mentioned before, we're talking about a class of about 5,000 compounds. Oops. So what about those others? What about the 4,000 some others? Frankly, very little is known about not even just the health effects, but what those other compounds are. So under the US toxic chemicals law, companies can keep even the chemical structure of a product of theirs secret from the public. It's called confidential business information. So there are a number of compounds in this class that researchers can't begin to assess their toxicity because they don't even know they exist. It's also a challenge when you go out wanting to test a drinking water supply and figure out, is this in there? It's very difficult to do if you very difficult to do if you don't know exactly what it is you're looking for. And then in a class that is that large, you run up against the limits of just academic expertise. Are there enough people who can assess the toxicity of these chemicals even if we knew what they were? Do we have the computing power to run the modeling that would give us some conclusions around that? So it's a really big challenge. There are some major scientific and technical challenges around assessing and addressing this class of chemicals. Now there are some that we have done a little bit more research on, that there has been a greater body of research around. And so 2 of those are Gen X and PFBS. So those are the 2 that have kind of emerged as major replacements for the longer change. So Gen X was the replacement for PFOA. So that's what has been used in Teflon and the like. And PFBS is the compound that 3M is now using in its Scotchgard product. So EPA last, I think it was December, put out draft toxicity values for Gen X and PFBS. And what they concluded was that these chemicals were also very toxic at low doses, low levels of exposure, but not quite as toxic as PFOA and PFOS. So let's talk about drinking water. EPA in 2016 put out a new drinking water health advisory for PFOA and PFOS together jointly. This was a revision of a 2009 provisional health advisory. In 2009, the recommended safe level of exposure, so kind of threshold, had been 400 parts per trillion. In 2016, the new health advisory level was 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS together. And this was a moment that was challenging for many communities because overnight, utilities were realizing, gosh, we are serving unsafe drinking water to our public, and it caused a lot of public consternation in communities where that was the case. That said, this is a health advisory. It is not enforceable. What it is meant to be is guidance from EPA to states and to communities about what a safe level of exposure is probably is for these chemicals. So let's think about here what it would take to actually do an enforceable drinking water standard. EPA has not issued a new drinking water limit for a new contaminant since the Safe Drinking Water Act was overhauled in 1996. Those of you who were here last week for Jen Dugan's talk heard a little bit about that. In 1996, Congress significantly raised the bar for what it takes for EPA to be able to regulate a chemical. In fact, they just proposed the first new limit just a few weeks ago. It was for a chemical called perchlorate. EPA had been looking at this chemical for close to 2 decades. It was the early 2000s when the state of California and others started raising concerns around perchlorate. It's an ingredient in rocket fuel. In 2011, EPA determined that the drinking water limit was needed. So that's the first step under the Safe Drinking Water Act, is issuing a regulatory determination. So 2011 to 2009, was what it took to do a proposal. And then we're not final yet. And actually, the proposal that was issued included an option for not doing a drinking water limit after all. So there are some major questions around whether or not EPA is going to be able to go through the new steps under the Safe Drinking Water Act to regulate new contaminants. A lot of folks had been looking at perchlorate as sort of the test case for whether or not it could be done. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, if you want to issue a drinking water limit, you need to have two things. You need to know that a chemical is harmful to human health, and you need to know that it is present in drinking water. So you could have a chemical that is the worst chemical in the world, but if it's not present in drinking water, you're not going to be able to issue a drinking water limit. So EPA has in fact done some testing around PFASs. So the way that this is done under the Safe Drinking Water Act is called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. Every 5 years, EPA comes out with a list of about 30 chemicals that they require drinking water utilities to test for, and that monitoring data is then used as a baseline for making a regulatory determination. So in the 2013 to 2015 timeframe, they had utilities monitoring for these 6 PFASs. Now, there are some major limits around this data. First of all, the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule only applies to the large drinking water utilities, those serving 10,000 people or more. It's the smaller systems, only a representative sample of 800 have to do the testing. And we know that those smaller systems represent the majority of drinking water systems in the country. And private drinking water wells aren't covered by this. The other challenge around these chemicals, around this testing, has to do with the minimum reporting levels. So if you look at these numbers, 40 parts per trillion for PFOS, 20 parts per trillion for PFOA, 90 parts per trillion for PFBS. Those levels look awfully high when you're comparing that to the new epidemiology and toxicology coming out around these chemicals that are finding health effects at single parts per trillion. But as I said, there are some major technical and scientific challenges around these chemicals. And back in 2013 or even earlier when this rule was being finalized, there wasn't the same sort of ability to test at low levels. For instance, these chemicals are really ubiquitous in our daily lives, right? What if the person doing the testing has PFAS in their deodorant? A lot of times the actual equipment that's being used to take the sample may have PFAS in it. You need a lab where PFAS hasn't been present in the lab environment. So there were some pretty big challenges, but everybody recognizes that the data that came out of this testing is limited. So what did they find? They found PFOA and PFOS in more than 100 drinking water systems, and they found 2 of the other chemicals, PFHSX and PFHPA, in more than 50 systems each. Outside groups have taken this data and extrapolated from it that that's probably about 16 million Americans drinking water that contains these chemicals. But again, those minimum reporting levels really limit that estimate. And in fact, the Environmental Working Group, which did that map earlier, has gone back to one of the labs that did a lot of this testing and gotten some additional data. And so they say they think it's probably more like 100 million Americans whose drinking water contains these chemicals. So I'm talking about drinking water, but this is a much broader problem than that. So it's an air issue. If you have heard about the facility in Fayetteville, North Carolina, it's a Chemours facility, had been discharging Gen X into the Cape Fear River, which serves as a drinking water supply for the city of Wilmington downstream. They were also finding Gen X in some of the wells near the facility. Some of those wells were located up gradient from the facility. So how's it getting there? What they figured out was that it was being discharged from the smokestack and then decomposing in the air and then filtering down through groundwater into those drinking water wells. Mentioned also that PFASs are in food packaging, so they're making their way into the food supply that way. We also know that they're showing up in biosolids that are being spread on farm fields, so we found it in the food supply as well. So let's get to the stuff I think about every day, the politics. This is a really interesting political issue. Think about President Trump. He talks repeatedly about crystal clean water and air on the campaign trail, and drinking water and water infrastructure has been a top priority for his administration at EPA. The staffers that I talk to say there is a very clear concern among the political staffers at EPA that they can't have another situation like Flint. They know that drinking water is something they have to handle well and that they need the public to trust them. It's also a really interesting issue when you think about the 2020 elections coming up. There are high-profile contaminations in states that are going to be central to that election. So the state of Colorado, Purple state turning blue. Senator Cory Gardner is a Republican up for re-election in 2020. The Republican base in Colorado is around Colorado Springs, where there's military communities. And there's a major PFAS contamination issue around there. Michigan, like I said, has gone out and proactively tested for these chemicals in their water supplies and are finding them. Of course, Michigan just had the Flint water crisis, so drinking water issues are very present in many voters' minds. Michigan was also crucial to President Trump's election in 2016. And then West Virginia is obviously a base for President Trump. As I've said, they had the issue around Parkersburg, West Virginia. And it's also worth noting that their Republican senator, Shelley Moore Capito, sits on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which is the committee that oversees EPA in the Senate. So, let me tell you how the Trump administration set out to tackle this problem. The end of 2017, then Administrator Scott Pruitt convened a sort of cross-agency effort on PFAS and called a national leadership summit on this challenge for May of 2018. And to that summit, he invited state leaders, trade groups, the associations that represent drinking water managers, and state officials. He invited environmental groups and industry. There was a little bit of controversy. Obviously there are many people with concern around this issue. It was a hot ticket to get in. And initially, community groups were not invited. In the end, they invited one representative from a community group from the Pease area in New Hampshire. But at the time, they said, we've got limited space, and we're going to be going out and doing community engagement sessions later. So the context for this summit was, again, May 2018. This was when a lot of scandal was swirling around Administrator Pruitt. This was as folks were talking about that below market rate apartment that he had rented from a lobbyist. There was concern around the expenses for his travel and his security detail. So it was in that context that this summit was held. And at the summit, he made a series of promises. I've got quotes for you from the EPA press release about the first two. So he committed to initiating the steps to evaluate a maximum contaminant level, so a limit, for PFOA and PFOS. That sounds a lot like that first step under the Safe Drinking Water Act of doing a regulatory determination. And then he committed to beginning the necessary steps to propose designating PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances through one of the available statutory mechanisms, including potentially CERCLA. Then he also committed to issuing groundwater cleanup recommendations for PFOA and PFOS and producing toxicity values for Gen X and PFBS. Those were the two I was talking about earlier. Following the national summit, EPA sent staffers out to, I think it was 5 or 6 communities around the country that have contaminations. One was in New Hampshire, in your EPA region, where I met folks from Bennington as well. That was the first one. And then other communities around the country, so communities like Fayetteville and North Carolina. And then the product of all of this was going to be a PFAS Action Plan, where EPA sort of laid out a roadmap for what they were going to do to handle these chemicals. This was not all happening in a vacuum, though. There were a lot of things happening, a lot of things swirling, and a lot of reporting happening at the same time. First off, right before the National Leadership Summit, reporters like me and a lot of environmental groups and other sort of public interest groups have been filing freedom of information requests to EPA, trying to find out what's going on behind the scenes, right? Under open records law, we were allowed to request internal emails, calendars, that sort of thing. The agency had been very slow in responding to a lot of those requests, and so in some cases, some groups sued. And around this time frame, we were getting dumps of documents from EPA. And in one of those dumps, we found some emails between officials at EPA and sort of forwarded emails from the White House, from officials at the White House. And one of those batches of emails showed concerns around a study being done by a division within the CDC around the toxicity of these chemicals. So the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry had been working on a toxicity profile for 6 PFASs, and at the beginning of that year was about ready to put it out. The numbers that they concluded for a safe threshold for these chemicals were an order of magnitude lower than what EPA's health advisory said. And so there was a lot of alarm at the White House and at the Defense Department around this. In fact, there was one of the emails said that this could be a potential public relations nightmare. And by the time we were looking at these emails in May, the profile still hadn't come out. So when we reported that, there was a lot of concern, a lot of suspicion that the report was being suppressed. And that happened, we reported that, I think, a week before the National Leadership Summit. So then, Pruitt had initially said that the PFAS Action Plan would come out in December of 2018. It was sent to the White House at the end of the year there for interagency review. So this is done with any proposed or final regulation and major documents or policy statements that the agency is putting out, that any federal agency is putting out. It goes to the White House for review, and that's where other agencies can weigh in and say this is how it will affect us. So it's interagency review. So we talked to some folks who had seen the document that EPA had sent to the White House for interagency review. And you know what wasn't in the document was a drinking water limit. So remember, Pruitt in May of 2018 had said, we're going to take the first step under the Safe Drinking Water Act of evaluating the need for a limit. So a lot of folks thought that was going to be in there, but it wasn't in the version that was sent to the White House. So we reported that, and it's worth noting that the time, at this point, Pruitt had left the agency, and President Trump had nominated the deputy, Andrew Wheeler, to take the top post. So his nomination was sitting before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. A week or two after that, we got some more Freedom of Information Act request documents back. Those were some calendars that we had requested. As I've talked about, there are major scientific and research challenges around this. And so everybody knew that EPA's Office of Research and Development was going to play a central role in figuring out how to get a handle on these chemicals. At the end of September, a new political official had come in to run that office. His name is David Dunlap. He's technically the #2 official in the Office of Research and Development, but that office has not had an assistant administrator, a top political official, for years, going back to the Obama administration. So he was effectively the top political official, although in that #2 spot, you don't need Senate confirmation. So he had come from Koch Industries, where he had been their top water and chemicals expert. And it's worth noting that Koch Industries owns Georgia Pacific, which is a very large paper and pulp mill conglomerate. And as we know, these chemicals are being used in food packaging, which is often produced by paper and pulp mills like those that Georgia Pacific owns. And Georgia Pacific has actually been named in at least one lawsuit over these chemicals. That is in Parchment, Michigan. So we reported that, and these calendars showed that he was very much involved in the development of this PFAS action plan. And we also got his recusal paperwork, which showed that he was not barred from participating in these matters. There's also been increasing evidence showing the role that the Defense Department had been playing in this process. Let's see. As I said, one of the commitments that Pruitt had made was to issue groundwater cleanup guidance for PFOA and PFOS. And that has major implications for the Defense Department about how stringently they're going to have to clean up their contaminated sites, those 401 sites I mentioned. So when that guidance went through the White House interagency review, OMB actually put out a red line copy of the guidance. So we get to see what went into the White House and what came out. And everything you see there in red was changes that were made at the White House. And a lot of they significantly weakened the guidance, the version that was ultimately produced. And we can see exactly what changed. So in February, in fact, on Valentine's Day of this year, EPA issued the PFAS Action Plan. It was a very romantic day for me. So we got to see what they actually ended up doing. So as I said, Wheeler's nomination was pending before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee at this time. 11 Republicans, 10 Democrats. They needed a majority to pass them. And Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia is there. She raised pretty publicly concerns around our reporting that EPA was not going to do a drinking water limit in here. And EPA changed what they put in the plan. They ended up including a sort of reiteration of Pruitt's commitment that they would do the first step under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they added a deadline to it. They said that would be done by the end of this year. They also moved forward with plans to do some additional monitoring. So remember all of the limitations around the last set of monitoring that EPA did. They're going to go back now and they're going to test for additional types of PFAS and at lower levels than had been done the last time around. So that could potentially help build the case for doing limits for a broader suite of chemicals. They reiterated that commitment to doing a hazardous substance designation and clarified that that was going to be under Superfund. And then they committed to doing more sets of toxicity values. So just a word about toxicity values. That is a way of saying how, it is a document that says how toxic a chemical is to the human body. It is a step or two removed from doing a drinking water limit. So if you wanted to, you can take a toxicity value and turn it into a drinking water limit. But there is some scientific work that has to go into that. You just have to decide what type of population you want to be protecting. Do you want to protect like a healthy adult male? Do you want to protect a breastfeeding infant? It takes some work. And so there's a little bit of controversy about the fact that EPA is only doing toxicity values. What EPA is saying is we're going to give this information to the states and they can decide what to do with it. What critics say is that many states are not in a position to be able to take that and translate it into something that is going to be usable to the public. And it also means that you could end up with, the state of New Hampshire having one number and the state of Vermont having another. So, how did people respond to the PFAS Action Plan? I might just let you read some of these. The state of New Jersey, the Department of Environment and Protection, put out a statement saying that this would leave millions of Americans exposed to harmful chemicals for too long. They were frustrated with the lack of urgency around the process. Senator John Barrasso, the chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. What you should know is that whenever the Trump administration takes an action, particularly the EPA, we often see statements of support come out from the top Republican on the committee. But what he issued in response to this plan was less than a full-throated endorsement of it. He, in fact, raised some concerns about it. And then we had community activists. A number of communities were really frustrated that there was not a drinking water limit in there. And another thing that many communities have asked for is for EPA to handle these chemicals not one by one, but as a class. A lot of public health groups make the same argument. Remember how we were talking about the enormous amount of work it will take to go through each of these chemicals individually. The way our regulations and law is set up is that you have to prove the harms of chemicals individually in most cases. But a lot of folks have really been pushing EPA to handle this group of chemicals as a class. And then we've got the industry response, 3M. Supports regulation rooted in the best available science, believe that this plan may prevent a patchwork of state standards that could increase confusion and uncertainty for communities. Well, that's exactly what's happening. So we know that a number of states have moved out on their own to set drinking water limits, and more states did so after the action plan came out in February. So this is just a sampling of some of what we're seeing at the state level. Most of these are in process. Very few, I think maybe just New Jersey on PFNA have actually gone through final, and it's going to take final regulations in order to require them to apply the DoD cleanups and others. But you will notice that many of the states are looking at chemicals beyond just PFOA and PFOS, and the numbers that you're looking at are in many cases significantly lower than what EPA has said. So Congress also wants a piece of this. In fact, as we speak right now, the Senate might be voting on a bipartisan package which has been introduced. So this has been the work of the Environment and Public Works Committee, but the way the Senate works, it takes a very long time to move any legislation through, so you have to kind of find a vehicle. So this is being debated on the National Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the few must-pass bills each year. So they have reached a bipartisan package that would do a series of things, some of which are listed here. So they would require EPA to set an enforceable drinking water limit for at least PFOA and PFOS within 2 years. And there is language in there that allows EPA to take what is known scientifically about one chemical or a couple chemicals and extrapolate from that to apply to the whole class, which is very unique. I don't think we've seen that done, certainly since the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments were put into place. It would also require additional monitoring. It would prohibit new uses of PFASs that are already in commerce unless they were proven to be safe. And it would also require that at least, I think it's about 200 or more PFASs be listed on the Toxics Release Inventory, which is a public right to know law, which would mean, even if there aren't limits on these releases, it would mean that companies and industries have to publicly report what they're emitting through air stacks or discharging into water. However, what is not in this bill is a Superfund listing. That is something that there's been a lot of effort around. A lot of folks see that as crucial, at least to getting DoD to do cleanups. and also being helpful for communities that might want to sue the potentially responsible party to help pay for the costs of filtration. But there has not been a deal brokered on that, at least as of half an hour ago when I checked my phone. So the challenges around this are that Superfund is a strict liability law. As we know, there are these are in products that we all use, right? If I'm a farmer and I get compost from my local wastewater treatment plant and spread that on my field and it turns to have PFAS in it, is my field now a Superfund site? Am I liable for it? The volunteer firefighters are concerned about this as well. So it's a really tricky political question, and then there is not a deal brokered on this yet. Now, there's definitely interest in this issue on the House side as well. They're going to be taking up the defense authorization after the July 4th recess, and some of the amendments that have been filed to that would cover the Superfund listing as well. And the positioning of the House is a little bit different. They appear to be prepared to take a more aggressive approach than the Senate on these chemicals. So just a moment to talk about the manufacturer side of things. 3M is the company that originally came up with this class of chemistries, and they are thought to be the largest producer, at least historically, of these chemicals. DuPont obviously played a large role as well. A few years ago, they spun off their perfluorinated business into Chemours. There's a lot of folks think that might have had to do with liability related to these chemicals, and we will see whether or not there's some active efforts to be able to try and reach back to DuPont around liability for some of these chemicals. There have been a number of lawsuits filed, dozens, and there have been two major settlements that serve as sort of guideposts here. One is that one in West Virginia that I mentioned, Parkersburg, where the C8 panel, the independent panel of experts, was used. That one settled last February, for $671 million. So that was 2 years ago. And it was settling more than 3,500 personal injury claims. So again, this was keying off of those 6 diseases that were definitively tied by the expert panel to PFOA exposure. The state of Minnesota is where 3M is headquartered. They sued 3M for natural resources damages, and the night before the case was set to go to trial, they reached a settlement for $850 million. A number of states have since followed suit. The state of New York was the next out of the gate. New Hampshire and New Jersey have recently filed litigation, and the state of Michigan has clearly signaled that they intend to. They put out a request for private law firms that have the resources and capacity to bring this sort of lawsuit, and it's thought that they could file their complaint by the end of the summer. And then I'm just going to leave you with one piece of litigation that is an interesting one to keep watching. So that West Virginia DuPont case was brought by a man named Rob Belote. He was a private attorney working on environmental issues, largely defending corporate companies, but he had a family connection to the Parkersburg area. And when some of the community there started to get concerned about what they were seeing, they reached out to him, and he brought that lawsuit. It's a really fascinating story. The New York Times Magazine did a profile of him a few years ago that's worth a read. So he was sort of the mastermind of this idea of having an independent panel of experts jointly selected by the plaintiffs and the defendants reach some conclusions. Because as we see in the courtroom and also in the regulatory field, the debate over definitively tying a particular chemical to a particular illness is one of the biggest hurdles in making any changes. And so this idea of having an expert panel that everybody is bound to their conclusions was really the thing that moved that particular case forward. So he, last fall, brought a lawsuit, a class action, on behalf of everyone exposed to these chemicals, with the lead plaintiff being an Ohio firefighter. And what it seeks to do, it's against all of the major manufacturers of these chemicals, and it seeks to do the same thing, to have an independent panel of experts assess the risks, and then hold the companies to those findings. And it would do the same thing for the entire class of PFASs. Now, many people think that having seen how the DuPont lawsuit played out, that no company is going to agree to that again, but it's definitely one to keep watching. So that is what I have for you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Expert panel idea is contrary to everything we teach in law school and learn as lawyers. Adversaries presenting their cases in court, their own set of experts, and they beat each other's brains out, and then the decision maker, a jury or a judge, weighs all the conflicting evidence, and based on this aggressive presentation of truth that our system can arrive at is produced. So this idea that early on the parties say, we'll hand this over to scientists is odd.
It is. I think.
If this is the context, the parties get together and say, let's see if we can settle this in a kind of outside the courtroom kind of way, coming up with a special process, or is this actually a court, judiciary administered dispute resolution?
I think it was the former. I think it was an agreement by both sides to let them go do this. It was so it was 3 academic researchers that were jointly selected by DuPont and by the plaintiffs. And my understanding is that they sort of went off and did their work and came back. They've got an entire website, linking all of the probable link reports, of which there are many. So they found links, on I think 6, but they went through many, many other ailments that plaintiffs had been alleging. So I think that my understanding is that a number of the plaintiffs or number of the members of the class dropped off after that. But yeah, it was a very unique approach, and as you describe, the way that it plays out in court through the legal system is very similar challenges around the ones that play out in the regulatory sphere, right? I mean, in the case of litigation, you've got either a judge or a jury, neither of which are likely to have the detailed scientific expertise that one might need to be able to parse through this data. And the backdrop to this is that the field of academic research in this area, many of the conclusions are conflicting, and folks on both sides of the issue from an activist standpoint are funding research, right? Like there is industry-funded research, and there is research funded by environmental groups where, people are coming to it with their own ideas. And so the way that then can skew that debate is really challenging.
Is there a way to remove that from the wastewater stream, whereas if we set a drinking water standard, is that really, or a cleanup standard, is that really just going to be dilution?
So there are filtration systems. Granulated activated carbon is the sort of preferred method for filtering drinking water. The problem is, what do you do with the chemicals that you have filtered out of there, right? Typically this would be incinerated, but these are highly persistent chemicals. Nobody knows what temperature you have to incinerate them to actually break that bond. And in the absence of figuring that out, are we just moving this waste stream from the water to the air? So there is very much an open question around that. That's one of the kind of top areas of interest for regulators. And in fact, the Senate bill that's being voted on probably today would require EPA to issue some guidance on that. But yeah, what you do with this is a major question. I think from the drinking water standpoint, we really are talking about filtration, so we're not diluting it in the drinking water, but where that goes is the open question.
What have you observed in terms of how 2 major political parties are responding to this issue, and do you have any observations about how this might play out in the upcoming presidential elections?
So, as I said, this is not the traditional Republican versus Democrat issue. Both parties are, or at least members of both parties are very concerned about this issue. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee held a hearing on PFAS, sort of leading up to this legislative compromise. And in that hearing, every single senator expressed worries about this. Every single senator was sort of pressing EPA, pressing the Defense Department on this issue. What exactly that translates into in terms of action is an open question. So in the Senate, we've seen compromise on everything but the Superfund listing. On the House side, there seems to be a little bit more churn around that. On one hand, the folks who are pushing for strict regulation are pushing for much stricter regulation. And I say folks, not one side or the other, because it really is it is an issue that both Republicans and Democrats are working on. There are definitely Republican members who are pushing for very aggressive regulation. The legislation is, one of the bills, the drinking water bill, would require EPA to set a single limit for all PFAS very aggressive, and critics say that there is reason to wonder whether that would hold up under the Safe Drinking Water Act or hold up to challenges afterwards. So it's, to a certain extent, it's an issue of geography on the House side, at least politically. The members who, like Fred Upton, who's the former chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction on this issue, has Parchment, Michigan in his district where there are huge problems around this. He's pushing for very aggressive regulation on this, whereas there are other members of the committee who don't have contaminated sites that have been found yet, at least, in their district, and they are taking a much more traditional line around, wanting best available science, and that's sort of the historically the fight around these types of issues, around chemicals issues, has been, wanting everything kind of hinged to the best available science, which is really problematic for a class of chemicals like this, where, the science would take years and years to be able to do. So, 2020 election. I talked a little bit about what President Trump has been saying on the campaign trail, very clearly, staking out drinking water as a priority issue for him. On the Democratic side, there are a few candidates who have taken a particular interest in this issue. Kirsten Gillibrand has sponsored some of the legislation that we've seen in the Senate, and as the senator from New York, dealt with this issue in Hoosick Falls, was pretty aggressive on it. She also played a big role in the overhaul of the Toxic Substances Control Act a couple years ago, so she's familiar with these issues. And then Cory Booker has also been active on it. It's come up a little bit. We'll see. New Hampshire is an early voting state, and New Hampshire, this is an issue in New Hampshire. New Hampshire's entire congressional delegation will put out statements around PFAS, so I expect that it will get some attention during the primaries there.
There are so many environmental issues where further research is needed, where that has led politicians and the general public to be able to dismiss it as something not to worry about for today. What is it that's different about this issue that has caused both parties to be equally incensed?
I think it's the politics of it. There are communities that are experiencing contaminations in almost every state, and I think that the reaction that you have to that is a pretty visceral human reaction. It's not a partisan reaction, right? Like, these are, man-made chemicals, and they're in my drinking water, and I just want them out. That is the reaction that most communities are having to it, and especially, the fact that we can't say what they mean to you and your children's health. People have a pretty strong reaction to that, and I think, for the same reason that clean drinking water is something that the Trump administration is very focused on, it's because that's an issue that's very different than climate change to people, right? Like, the immediacy of it is something that really hits people at home, and I think I think people know that an issue like that is going to upset people and motivate them to act in a way that few other environmental issues will.
It's the human health component.
Mm-hmm.
And people have the environmental.
Exactly.
The very low levels of detection, which are, I think, relatively new, make this that much harder, and how is the technology on that?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the very end of
Where's
that.
the technology on that, on those low levels of detection? We've mostly seen PPB, now we're looking at PPT.
Mm-hmm.
Are we equipped nationally to be able to?
So yeah, capacity is definitely an issue, and I think that we're going to see a lot of discussion around that as EPA tries to require this next round of monitoring. So the agency, one of the areas that they have been working on, and one of the things that was in the action plan that I didn't read out there, is work on additional validated testing methods. So you want to make sure that the way that you're testing over here, if you're testing the same water sample, this lab is going to get the same result as that lab. So EPA has been doing a lot of work on that issue, trying to get validated testing methods. I think they've got maybe around 20 chemicals for which they have that, but that is very much it's a challenge. And I think that even when you have a validated testing method, having labs that, enough lab capacity to be able to do that is going to be a challenge. And we're talking about validated testing methods for drinking water. Groundwater is a whole different animal. So if you want to be testing the levels in groundwater, you have a totally different set of testing methods and different requirements around labs. So it is very much a hurdle. It's not a hurdle that people really want to the public wants to think about or talk about, but regulators certainly are.
Do you have, in your reporting and talking to experts, have you formed any conclusions about why be a broken law, what you and Jen have presented. Why is it broken, and why is it broken?
So here is the political dynamic around the Safe Drinking Water Act. So law was passed in '74. The initial statute, I believe, required EPA to set limits for a series of chemicals. They kind of did those, but were having trouble moving past that. And so in '86, Congress came in and amended it again and said, you are going to set drinking water limits for X number of chemicals on an annual basis. And they started churning out drinking water limits. The thing is that a drinking water limit applies to every water utility around the country, whether or not they have that chemical in their drinking water or not. And it can be very costly, and there can be the types of challenges we were just talking about around lab capacity to do the testing. So, if I sit in, a small town in Minnesota, and I have a small rate base, I have, my water rates are pretty high because I'm in a rural area and I have to pay to upkeep the pipes that go, all over my community. I have to go out and fight every year with my ratepayers to increase their rates. And now all of a sudden, I've got to spend money to test for all these chemicals that aren't in my drinking water anyway. That is the political challenge that you're dealing with, and the National Rural Water Utilities Association is very active on this. We know, Jen also talked about the huge infrastructure challenges. Most of the drinking water pipes around the country are aging and failing. We've got problems around lead. EPA is working on a lead and copper rule that would mandate replacement of lead pipes nationally over a period of years. That's going to be hugely expensive. I mean, it becomes a money issue. And the challenge is if you're a utility that doesn't have these chemicals in their water and you're having to spend money every single month to test for them, it feels very frustrating. And so there's a lot of pushback. And of course, at the same time, federal funding to drinking water utilities is not always what is needed to keep up with it. So in '96, when they passed these amendments that made it harder, there was actually a political deal brokered at the time. I think it created, or at least up to the authorization for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which is the mechanism that federal dollars get sent out to states and then to drinking water utilities for infrastructure upgrades. So the deal was, okay, we'll make it harder, we'll add these new requirements around setting a drinking water limit. In exchange, the Democrats got additional money. So that was the deal that was brokered then. I will say there's definitely concern about that on the Hill right now. And in fact, the House has indicated that the Democrats in the House have indicated that they want to try and reform the law. It's going to be a challenge. There were some major reforms that were passed last year as part of a different water infrastructure bill, having to do more with the Army Corps of Engineers. So the low-hanging fruit was done then. It's going to be a lot harder. The fight over sort of the ability to set limits is going to be the much bigger fight, and there's less that the parties can agree on around it. So I don't know that anybody's expecting that the underlying law is going to be reformed immediately.